Okay, let's talk about the 6. The 6 is a very interesting number. It is my number, so this is the one that I can probably speak to you most confidently about. The reason that I start off by saying it's an interesting one is because I want you to look at the naming of the 6. And there's something that's unique about the 6 compared to the other numbers. If we look back over the other numbers, the names, and we give 2 different names for each one, right? Notice that the names are typically synonyms, right? Like for the 5, what you just looked at, the investigator, the observer. Those are very similar. For example, the 3 was the achiever or the performer. It's very, very similar. They're typically synonyms. But if you look at the 6 is called the loyalist or the skeptic. To me, there's a little bit of a tension there. There's a little bit of a paradox between those. Those two don't work in harmony. Being loyal to something and skeptical of something feel like opposites. So hold on to that for a second, and we're gonna talk about that. We're gonna hit on why that's the case with the 6, and it's actually going to be really helpful to know what the 6 is like and what's going on with the 6. Okay, let's skip over again the wings and integration, disintegration. We'll hit all those later. Let's move to the sin. So remember, the sin of the head overall is fear. All of the head space is dealing with fear in some version of that, some manifestation of fear. The 6, fear equals fear. The 6 is the most embedded in a fearfulness. We'll talk about what that looks like as we move down through. The virtue then, it would be courage. So the 6s can display great courage in certain situations. This is the virtue that God has given them. The true self is to be courageous, but they have covered that with this fearfulness, this mask of fear. And we're gonna dive into that. So, head orientation, as we already said, they react to fear, which is the sin of the head, through pessimism, even more fear, just layer on as much fear as you can possibly get. Or, as we've talked about with almost all the numbers so far, there's always some aspect of overcompensation going on, right? There's some aspect of each number is overcompensating for what they sense in themselves is lacking. And this can be true of the 6. Many 6s you will find to be overly confident about some aspect of their lives because they're compensating. They're trying to make up for what they feel is an uncertainty and feel like they have a fear that needs to be compensated for. Okay, if you want to know what deep down is driving pretty much all 6s, it is this very, very scary idea for a 6 that the world and most of the people and events in it are dangerous, unpredictable, uncertain. And this can absolutely drive a 6 mad. This is the ultimate basis deep down for the fear of a 6. They look out at the world and they say, this is not a safe place to be. It's chaos. It's uncertain. It's irregular, unpredictable, and all of those things cause fear in the 6. Now, the rest of what I'm going to describe then for you is going to be the strategy of a 6 to try to either hide themselves from that fact, keep that reality of the chaotic nature of the world as far away from them as possible, or to overcompensate, as we were saying, overcompensate for the fear in a way that will then allow them to remove themselves from the fear as much as possible. Some people make a mistake in saying that all sixes are afraid of everything. And that actually is pretty far from the truth. You will find that some sixes aren't even in touch enough with what's going on in them that they recognize fear as the main motivator of what is going on and what is happening to them. That is because they have come up with really good compensation strategies, and we'll get into what some of those are. So let's circle back here to the loyalist and skeptic that I mentioned off the top. A lot of times what you will find with sixes is any new idea, any new relationship, any new piece of information that you introduce to a six, they are going to immediately be very skeptical of it. They're going to ask a lot of questions. They are going to push very, very hard on whatever you are introducing to them. They're not typically very good with change. Changing things quickly and suddenly on a six is not going to go super well. They're going to react fairly negatively in most cases to that. And this, and I'm explaining why. Because sixes need to know, in order to feel safe, what they can trust. What can they put their trust in that will be solid ground for them? What will hold up to scrutiny? What will hold up to putting some pressure on it? So because of that, sixes put lots of pressure on any new thing, any new idea, any new person they meet. Sixes are definitely testing for reliability at all times. They're testing everything in their lives for reliability. Until they come to the conclusion that something is reliable, that something is trustworthy, that they can put their faith in a particular person, place, or thing. And if that happens, now you go from being the skeptic as the six to the loyalist. And sixes can be extremely loyal to things that they have determined they can put their trust in. And we're going to circle around to that again in just a second. As we go through the notes here, the next line says that sixes need to know the rules, the values, the pillars that make up and solidify a community, that solidify a worldview, because, let's tie everything back to this fear, because they need to know if they can trust it. They want to know, is this going to be consistent? Consistency tends to be extremely important, extremely valuable to a six. And then, as the next little subpoint says, so here's the interplay between this. They challenge things at first to test their reliability, then they can become fiercely loyal to that community, that idea, that person once tested. Once tested, not just tested, but once found to be reliable, found to be trustworthy. Okay. They desire security, another word for safety here. They desire security and authority figures who can give it to them. Sixes tend to be very much tied to a certain person or a certain group of people that they have found or decided that they can trust, and they tend to give much of their loyalty to that figure, to that person, to that system. I can give you some examples. For me, and we'll talk about wings here in a second. I told you in the description of the 5 that I actually thought at first that maybe I was a 5. And the reason why is because one of the things that I found trustworthy is math in my life. I found that being able to calculate probability, statistics, analytics, those things tended to be more trustworthy and more reliable than just what you might hear people say, go with your gut, right? I've never been very trusting of my gut. I don't feel like my gut leads me to the right place at all times, always. And so I'm much more likely to put my trust in numbers, to put my trust in calculations, analytics, things of that sort. So for me, that holds a huge place of authority in my life. If I am going to buy a big product, a new product, I want to know if I can trust it first. And I tend to do a ton of research to make sure that all the reviews, the consumer product ratings, all this stuff. I will put a ton of time and energy into researching all of that before I make a big purchase. I play like fantasy sports, and the way that I watch sports, I want to know the analytics behind what's going on. A lot of people say, well, that takes all the fun out of the game. Not for me. To me, it gives me more certainty as to whether I can trust what I'm seeing. Can I trust my eyes? Can I trust what seems to be true of whatever I'm watching? And for me, it takes the analytics of that. This probably explains why I made an entire rating system and have rated every movie, like we were talking about on retreat, every movie I've ever watched. To me, this helps me to say, did I like that movie or not? Well, I can go back and look at the system that I've created of analytics to tell me how much I liked this movie after I watched it. Okay, so there's a little bit of interplay here between the 6 and the 5. You can probably tell that has a trace of 5-ness in it. Maybe you can see why I thought maybe I was a 5 at first. But what's really going on there, I think, is a little bit of wing action. We'll talk about wings later, of course, and what's really happening with wings. But I'm using the analytical bent of a 5 in my wing as something of an authority in my life. And I believe I can trust that authority more than I can other things. And so I put a lot of time and effort and reliability into them. They prefer, 6s do, very predictable, as we've said, very consistent systems and people. 6s tend to be drawn to people that they feel like they can trust. If you seem very unpredictable, if you seem very chaotic to a 6, they are probably going to avoid you like the plague. So do not take offense to that, but there are probably certain other types around the circle of the Enneagram that 6s tend to be either more drawn to or less drawn to because of that. If you are more consistent, if you are more trustworthy, if you're more reliable, if they feel like they know what to expect in your emotions, in your reactions, in how you will approach them, then they will be fiercely loyal friends to you, and they will be probably some of your very best friends, people that will never leave your side. If they find you to be very unpredictable in those things, it may be more difficult to connect with a 6. 6s can confuse thinking and doing. A 6 will spend a lot of time preparing mentally, creating systems. And I think this is an important thing. Maybe I should have mentioned earlier in the description. You will find that the difference between 6s are what systems they are creating around themselves and putting their trust in to insulate themselves from the fear that's all around them. But within the spectrum of 6s, right, you will also notice, I think, once you dig down deep enough, that all of them have some system. They might be different systems, and so 6s don't look exactly like each other at all times, but they do all put their faith in some system. They have built something around them that provides that consistency, that reliability that they need in their life. So, let's get back to this thinking and doing then. 6s, a lot of times, the system that they build is creating enough time and enough space for themselves to think through any problem that they're facing. If I can just sort myself through this problem, this issue, this project that I have to work on. I need a time to get my head wrapped around it. You'll hear sixes use this kind of language a lot of times. I need to get my head wrapped around this. I need to think my way through it. What they're doing is they're trying to get the time and the space to create a system in their mind that will help them to navigate the uncertainty of whatever it is that they're facing. So a lot of times with a six, you might ask them, let's say like that a six works for you and you're like a project manager for them. And you're like, hey, how's the project coming? A six might say, it's coming along pretty well. And you might think that means, oh, they're almost done. They've finished the project. But what it might really mean for a six is that they are starting to wrap their mind around the concept of the project enough that maybe they're getting ready to start. But because that's such a huge issue for a six, it feels like they're almost done in some way. That's what I mean by confuses thinking and doing. Let's go back to this idea of the six as a skeptic at first. They tend to ask a lot of questions, and thus they can be extremely in the camp of a dream killer. If you are one of the numbers that is a dreamer, sixes can be very difficult to work with and deal with, because anytime you come to them with a new idea, with a dream that you're having, and you might just want them to dream along with you, right? But a six struggles to do that. A six is going to immediately say, oh, new idea, alarm, 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 the red buzzer's going off for me. Is this something that we can trust? Is this something that I can put any faith into? I don't know. So what do I do when I don't know? I am going to give you a barrage of questions, of challenges. It's going to feel like I have never hated an idea more than I hate your idea. Because I'm going to try to poke holes in the whole thing to know, is this something that I can really get behind? And so that can be really difficult for people dealing with sixes at first, I feel like. Okay, let's talk about sixes on a spiritual level. The spiritual hang-up of a six. A lot of times, sixes tend to be potentially Christians and or believers in some big institution or some big idea like religion, like God. So you might think, well, sixes are probably pretty spiritually, okay then. They're probably in a pretty good place. Well, not necessarily. Because what sixes tend to do is sixes want to know, both in our relationships with humans and our relationship with God, if we can trust that person, if we can trust God. And how do we know if we can trust God or not? Well, we need to know how consistent God is, how reliable God is. Now, we have stories and stories in Scripture of God being faithful to his people. So that's great. That's helpful for a six. The problem is that as we read different stories in Scripture, it can be difficult to predict how God is going to react, not just to a group of people, but to a specific person that God is dealing with. And that can be very, very scary for a six. You might remember back to my own personal story when I was, 4 years old and my mom was reading me Bible stories before bed, and my first prayer laying in bed after hearing the story of God calling to Samuel was, God, do not do that to me. Because I'm thinking this is what God does. God deals with people by yelling out to them at night while they're trying to go to bed in the darkness and the aloneness of their room. No way, Jose. That's super scary. And so I'm just assuming, God's always the same, right? If I'm going to be able to trust God, he's going to always do things the same way. He's going to treat people in similar situations the exact same way. The problem with that is not the God of Scripture. It really isn't. God is a discerner of people's hearts, and he comes and he interacts with you and he challenges you on the things that are plaguing you specifically and personally. That is the God that I have come to know as I actually go through Scripture and be honest with myself about what God is really like. This is a huge problem for a 6 because this steers God into the realm of unpredictability. It steers him into what seems at times to be inconsistency. And that is very, very scary. That feels chaotic, that feels unpredictable, and that leads to the feeling of fear for a 6. So, what we tend to do with God as 6s then is we tend to force him into boxes. We tend to force him into a very black and white, God does this, God doesn't do this. God is like this, God is never like this. That makes us feel safe. That makes us feel secure to be able to interact with that God. The problem is that's not the real God. We are interacting with a cardboard cutout of a God that we have created to feel safe enough in his presence. I don't know how many of you have read C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia, but at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Tumnus and Lucy are talking, right? And Tumnus is talking about how Aslan is good, but he's certainly not safe. And that's really difficult for a 6 to hear, because to us, safeness does equal goodness. How could something be good but not safe? So that's a big struggle for 6s to kind of wrap our minds around this idea that God is very good even if he's not predictable. God is not what you want him to be. God is his own being, and that's safe enough. So that's the spiritual struggle of a 6. Okay, let's talk about growth. Growth for a 6, lean into ambiguity, right? Ambiguity, I believe is how we pronounce that word. Lean into the ambiguity of the world. Let that simmer and let that be okay. Because things don't have to be so certain all the times. And notice 6s love clarity. We actually love certainty. But certainty is not really possible in this world and not possible with the God that we have. There is no such thing really as certainty for humans. And 6s must be okay with that. We must get that knocked into our hard heads. And so I find that clarity as opposed to certainty is a nice step for 6s. Clarity means like, I can see the direction something is headed. This feels like something that I can put enough of my trust in to be okay with, even if I realize that I can never reach absolute 100% certainty on everything. That's just impossible. 6s also, I think, need to trust themselves and their feelings. If you want, stop here for a second and read the passages. Somebody read Genesis 32, verse 30. And then once that person reads that one, someone else volunteer and read 1 John chapter 4, verse 18. And those will give you a little peek into growth for a 6 scripturally. So I'll give you a second to do that. You can stop this if you want, if you need the time. You probably should stop this really quickly. Okay, hopefully you read those verses then. Let's talk about helping a 6. Helping a 6, you will get nowhere with a 6. You will never get anywhere with a 6. You will never be able to budge them and help them to grow at all if you are not providing some amount of loyalty and consistency and a predictable environment for them at the outset. So that's kind of the starting place with a 6. Provide that stability that they need, and within a safe environment for them, now you're going to help them be more spontaneous, more free, less rigid, less tied down to the predictability that they really value, that they really tie themselves to most of the time. Okay, that's it for a 6. Just same as the 5. Stop this. Well, it's going to stop on itself. when the video's over. Go ahead and before you start the next one, before you start the 7, take some time to talk about the 6. Does this seem to describe you at all? Is there anything that you feel like resonates with you or that you see in some people around you? Discuss, which aspects stood out to you about the 6. And feel free to shoot me any questions. You can pop those right into the group me, and I'll check that several times a day and try to help you understand if there was anything that was unclear. And so take a few minutes to talk, and then come back, and we'll talk about the 7 next.